Welcome, everyone. I am Courtney Cheetah, and I am a program associate with Wild Farm Alliance. Thanks for joining us today for the first Roll of Birds on Midwest Farms webinar. This is the first lesson of 10, and our mission is to promote a healthy, vibrant agriculture that protects and restores wild nature, and we help bring wild nature back to farms. Our 2050 vision is to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms, hedgerows of habitat the length of the moon and to the moon and back to help all different kinds of beneficials on the farm and restore riparian areas because they are the lifeblood of the landscape. And avian pest control is a part of the toolbox for managing crops. We are really excited to announce that we have a new publication that is protecting birds in agricultural landscapes. Birds play a vital role in agricultural landscapes, providing natural pest control, lowering reliance on chemical inputs, and contributing to the overall resilience of farming and ranching systems. This publication highlights ways farmers can reduce risks to birds while maintaining productive working lands. In addition to this publication, there is a treasure trove of publications in our resource section of our website, including info on nesting structures for beneficial songbirds on Midwest farms and the beneficial bird native plant chart for the upper Midwest. Today's webinar is all about why birds belong on the farm, biodiversity, pest control, and a thriving landscape. We have researcher Sarah Cross from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand and Joanne Baumgartner, the Executive Director of Wild Farm Alliance, with us today. Next month, will be our second lesson, and it's going to be all about American kestrels as pest control allies on the farm. And that'll be on October 14th from 11 a.m. To 12 p.m. And going forward, all of the webinars in the series will be at Tuesdays at 11. Today, we're meeting a little bit later for Sarah, who's joining us from New Zealand, so she didn't have to join us in the middle of the night. We are offering 1 credit of continuing education credits from the American Society of Agronomy. And to receive credit, please have your license number handy and enter it into the evaluation form at the end, which we'll be sharing at the end of today's webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing so that Joanne can share hers, and we're going to start with her. And if you're having issues, let us know, and we can try and help. And I'm going to turn it over to Joanne.
Yeah, welcome everybody. I am going to talk about a couple of things. I'm going to talk about economic ornithology and also what birds need. It's been probably forever. Farmers have noticed as long as there's been farmers have noticed that birds are eating pests. But in 1885, it was funded, this topic of economic ornithology was funded by Congress so that the Department of Agriculture in the US could start to study it. And over a period of before that, from 1817 to 1936, there was almost 1,500 studies published on economic ornithology. So that is birds providing pest control services. There were some really beautifully written and with drawings of birds, beautifully written publications back 100 years ago. Birds of California in relation to the food industry, useful birds and their protection. There is also this graphic I love. It's the arrows pointing to goals following the working of the field, and it says goals following the plow, picking up alfalfa weevils. That was in 1920. They asked that economic ornithology section asked farmers to kill birds, pickle their stomachs, and mail them in. And they looked at 80,000 bird stomachs. They could only look at the things they could see under a microscope, whereas today, I think Sarah will probably mention how they're looking at, we have way cooler tool or way more advanced tools, but still they learned a lot. And they would uh, create these graphs like this one here, where this is showing animal food at the top and vegetable food of an American crow and their proportions of what they eat. And you can see as the different seasons progress, they start eating more and more insects, and they're not eating corn. But then later on, they start eating more. And American crows are omnivores like us. There's lots of insectivores that eat little crops. And when they do eat non-animal food, it's usually in the winter. Um, this is the publication Practical Value of Birds. And this is just showing you some of the details that they were collecting back then. For red-tailed hawks, they looked at 562 stomachs and found 278 mice, 131 other mammals, and 47 insects. At the same time, we were learning all about how important birds were. Birds were really under the gun, so to speak, with market hunting, but also really impacted by the millinery trade. Some women's hats had up to 3 stuffed birds on them, and birds or people who cared about birds were really concerned. And so Congress in 1918 passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But the market hunters and others were pushing back and saying, wait a second, is this really this? We don't need this. But the Supreme Court upheld it in 1920, saying we shouldn't sit by while a food supply is cut off and the protectors of our forests and our crops are destroyed. We are of the opinion that the treaty and the statute must be upheld, which was cool. So the history of avian pest control. I had mentioned that when uh, after the World War I and II, there's a lot more chemicals, then avian pest control studies waned. There was still groups in USDA or people in USDA concerned about how or are knowledgeable about how important birds were. And I thought this graphic was really fun. This is showing if you have a fence row without any shrubs, you're going to have a lot of pests like this grasshopper. And grasshopper is too much for her, is harassing the quail, the rats and mice and rodents are all having a field day. They are increasing in numbers. Whereas if you have a hedgerow or shrub fence row, you're going to have a lot more beneficial insects. And look at the kale really knocked out that grasshopper, and the shrews are chasing the rodents. So anyways, a little fun. So back in, I think it was 9 years ago, Sarah and I and Sasha, he started working on this publication, which then came out soon after that, supporting beneficial birds and managing pest bird. You can download this for free from our website in the resources section. And in it, we talk about 120 different studies looking at avian pest control, and 90% of them showed that birds were important for that. It was all kinds of crops, from vegetables to fruits and nuts and grasslands, and also looking at raptors eating rodents. So that's a really nice resource if you want to dig into it more. And Sarah and I were just seeing how we really should update it. So to give you some perspective, when a farm is pretty non-diverse, and it might look like this, it's not going to support as many birds as a farm that has diversity. And so when you break that down, the birds are they don't all just come to the same resources on the farm. Some birds are attracted to riparian habitats or low shrubs. Others are in living canopy, and others high in the canopy. Um, there's been some really great studies about avian pest control. Like this one was showing how when you put in hedgerows, the birds are eating more pests next to kale crops, or kale crops next to the hedgerows. Um, Put in just a row of sunflowers that gives some structure and perching for birds. They help reduce pests in crops. Um, Birds that are arboreal, that live in trees, will come into apple orchards and help reduce pests. And in corn and soybean fields, they help. It just says corn, but they help reduce corn and soybean pests. Um, and you're going to hear more about some of these studies later in this series, or maybe from Sarah too. So, what do birds need? They need food. They need shelter from the elements and predators. They need water, and they need nesting sites. So, food could be food like plant food, berries, but also sometimes they eat petals. Some birds drink nectar. Plants also support insects that are really important, and caterpillars specifically can be a really high protein source for young nestlings. And in this study, they were looking at how chickadees had to have at least 70% native habitat in the city if they were going to have successful nests. And uh, it was related to the fact that trees, like shown here in this list, over on the East Coast, um, this was Delaware, I think, and research from Doug Tallamy. Oak trees will support up to 500 caterpillars, and you can see there's other trees that, depending on what they are, can also support lots of food for birds. This chart shows the different kinds of um, insects that these 16 different families were um, eat, and the green bar is showing how important caterpillars are. If you have, you might think if you see a shrub line or tree line that is really great on a farm for birds, and yes, it will provide the structure, and sometimes that also means there is nesting cavities. Uh, Not just to shelter and build nests, but the caterpillar food may not be there if those plants are non-native, because those insects those plants, when they're in their native ranges, will have the native insects there. Um, so another thing birds need are shelter. It's good to have year-round shelter, like not just all deciduous plants, but it's also good. We tell growers when they put up nest boxes, it's also good to have some cover nearby for the fledglings. When they first come out of a nest box, they're kind of clueless about how to stay safe, and so having some habitat for them too is important. Some shelter. Water resources, of course, birds drink water. They need to keep their feathers clean. And some birds, like swallows and some phoebes, use mud for nests, and that takes water. And then nest sites. I mentioned nest boxes that you can put up, but you can also put in habitat. Native habitat is great. This is a red-winged blackbird nest in elderberry. And the crops themselves can sometimes support nests. Like this is warblers in a pluot nest, a pluot orchard. Um, we've published this document, nesting structures for beneficial songbirds in the Midwest. And in it, we talk about how the eastern bluebird, you can support the eastern bluebird with a nest box. And when you do, you with our publication, learn about what kinds of insects they eat, where they're foraging, where to put up the nest box, how far apart to put up nest boxes, what their eggs look like, and they build nests inside. And you can often open up a nest box and tell who's there, even if they have left, by the nest that they made. But there's other birds that use the eastern bluebird nest box, including these, the black-capped chickadee, several or a couple different nuthatches, the tree swallows, tufted titmice, house wren, and the prothonory warbler. Um, we have this cool farmland flyways map that as farmers put up nest boxes, they are registering with our site, and please check it out. We have, um, I forget how many are on there. It's a lot. We can, I could probably tell you that at the break, but in any case, you just go there if you have nest boxes and you answer a couple questions, and then you pop up on the map. So we also have this publication, Beneficial Bird Native Plant Chart, and in it we have listed, this is just an example of native trees and shrubs that we've listed, and it gives plant characteristics that support birds. For instance, the darker the caterpillar, the better support, or the darker of these images, this is for general shelter cover. This is nesting, and this is food and bird or plant food, and then nesting. And the last publication I was going to talk about is this Beneficial Bird Habitat Assessment Native Plant Tool. Actually, we have a California version, and we're working on a national version, which where we're focusing in the Midwest as part of that. And it is gonna not just look at all the values of plants, which is part on this lower half, but also the values of landscape around the farm, farmscape features, and farm management. So you can design the farm thinking about the birds' foraging strategies and these other factors, and you'll get different birds, like birds that are fly catching or aerial diving, they're ground foraging or foliage gleaning, air foraging, soaring, stalking, bark foraging. It's pretty much covered. So when you do that and you have habitat, now not all farms want hedgerows. We recognize that if you're in a prairie system and you just have low growing plants, then that's what you should keep. But if you have shrubs and trees around, then putting in that habitat is good. And connectivity, connecting habitat is great. It offers safety for birds. Coarse pastures support different kinds of birds, as do riparian habitat. Having non-cropped areas support different kinds of birds, and having a crop diversity does. And then you start to get these different birds, and you also get beneficial insects, which is part of a different talk, but I thought it was cool to leave them in there because they too help support with pest control. And I'm going to leave it at that and stop sharing and hand it back over to Courtney.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joanne. That was really great. We have a couple poll questions that we're going to launch here. They should pop up right there. So we'd love you to participate and let us know what you learned. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, and Joanne, you want to go over the results? Tell us what
Yeah,
the results.
sure. It looks like the first question was a little confusing, but the answer is the second answer, that When did the division of economic ornithology begin? That was in 1885. And what slowed its progress? The development of organic chlorines like DDT. And then the second question, what are the main requirements of birds? Almost everybody got that right. Food, water, shelter, and nest sites.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we are ready to jump into Sarah's talk. So I'll let you share your screen and have at it.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon where you are. I'm joining you this morning from New Zealand, where I am in the future. It's Wednesday morning. Um, and thank you for scheduling this one to be a little bit later so I didn't have to get up quite so early. It's 7 a.m. here, so it's 7:30, so it's pretty good. Um, so as you can probably tell from my accent, I am not actually from New Zealand, but I live here now. I'm originally from New York City, actually, so it's a little bit, I guess I'm a fish out of water in many ways working on farms, but come from a family that farmed a couple generations past. And I'm not only an academic, but I'm also a member of the board of the Wild Farm Alliance. So I get to kind of straddle both the science part and actually doing the research, as well as helping with outreach and thinking about how this research can be used by all of you that work with farmers or are farmers yourselves. Um, Feel free to get in touch. Our emails are a bit long, but it's essentially just my first name dot last name at canterbury.ac.nz. And I'm here in Christchurch on the South Island of New Zealand. So Joanne talked a bit about what birds need. I'm going to cover a little bit of that and then talk more about the type of science that we do to study the effects of birds on farms. But just taking a step back to why this is important, not only for farmers, but also for birds. We've seen really, well, we haven't seen in our generations, but over the past couple of hundred years, there have been immense changes on the planet's surface in terms of how much is actually being used for farming. So if you kind of added up all the farmlands on the planet, it would be the largest terrestrial biome that we have. It's over 40% of the world's ice-free land is being used for farming in one way or another, which is an immense amount of the planet. And not only is there a very large footprint for farming, but farming has intensified over time through things like the Green Revolution and then more recent technological advances, so that in some ecosystems, most of the primary productivity that's occurring or the photosynthesis that's occurring is being used by agriculture, and often it's well above what you would normally have in those systems. And a lot of that is because of inputs like chemical inputs like fertilizers or the use of pesticides or things like that, but also because of changes in the way that we farm. So in the 1800s and the early 1900s, most farms would have looked like what you see on the left here in landscapes that once had trees in them. Um, and nowadays they look more like what you'd see on the right here. So farm fields getting larger, and most of those areas between those farm fields being removed in favor of a kind of cleaner and more easily moved around in agricultural landscape. So we call that landscape simplification. And as you can see very clearly in these photos, it leads to pretty major changes in the type of habitat that's available in our typical farming agroecosystem. But these landscapes are really important for birds and for other wildlife. And because the footprint of agriculture is so large, wildlife needs to be able to either move through them or use them at different parts of the year. This is a photo of the Birdcast website, which is really fun to look at. And this is the forecast for bird migration traffic over the country just last week. So on the night of 20th of September last week, there was an estimate of 557 million birds that were going to be flying over the country that night. Most of our neotropical migrants that are going from Canada and the northern parts of our country down to the south and then into South America for some species, Central and South America. Most of them fly at night and are migrating at night. So this is what they were predicting that traffic would look like, and being in the Midwest is an amazing place to be in both the spring and fall migrations. So combined, the expansion and the size of the footprint of agriculture, and then how intensely farms are being managed, has led to what's been called the greatest extinction threat to birds. Because those two factors alone are causing major declines in birds, not only in the United States, but globally. And as Joanne pointed out, there are lots of things that birds need on farms or in general, but providing these on farms becomes very important, and often augmenting these where they've been removed from farming landscapes is really, really critical to the conservation of birds. So we often want to think, can we make farms more bird friendly? And I think a lot of what the Wild Farm Alliance does and a lot of what my research does is not necessarily thinking about really large shifts in the the footprint of agriculture itself or of individual farms, but thinking about the spaces between. So in this example from the Central Valley of California, um, this area that's being used as a check for some of the water that's being moved for irrigation here, this is being probably sprayed every year to remove any vegetation from it or sometime disked under, and these can be really covered in weeds. But a lot of the farmers that we've been working with have been planting hedgerows along these habitats that are essentially unused for farming, to see if that they can provide more habitat for beneficial birds and for other wildlife. So I wanted to show you just one example of like many, many examples that have demonstrated how habitat can be important for birds on farms. And this is from my own research in California, where we worked in the Central Valley. If any of you are not familiar with it, it's that green bit right down the middle of California. About a third of the produce grown in the United States is from the Central Valley. It's pretty diverse in terms of a farming landscape because so many crops are grown there. Um, but in terms of a landscape for birds, it's actually pretty simplified in that there aren't very many sources of natural habitat there aside from these pretty narrow riparian corridors that you can see in this picture here that move through some of that farming landscape. So thinking about a typical field like this, which if you were something like a yellow warbler migrating from Mexico up to breed in California, flying over this sort of field would not be very inviting. But farmers that have either retained or planted riparian plantings along the edges of their fields or planted native hedgerows along some of the other edges might be providing those birds with a place to stop over and refuel if they're on their way north, or to potentially stay and breed and raise a family. So we did this study across 103 different farms, which varied in what type of habitat they had. So going from bare edges like the one I showed you before to established tree lines and hedgerows and those more complex riparian habitats. Um, and they also varied in how isolated they were from this mountain range that's kind of on the left of the map here, which is the Berryessa region, if any of you are familiar with the Central Valley. And so we were looking at what birds were found on each of these spots, depending on how far they were from this forest landscape or from some of these major riparian areas, and what kind of habitat they had along their edges. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so I'm a little bit hoarse. Um, Really kind of unsurprisingly, we have a great field of dreams scenario that occurs when we put habitat back into farmland. And that when you have no habitat along the edge compared to when you do have habitat along the edge of fields, we had between 7 and 8 more bird species. So going from very few bird species, which is what this one on the top is showing you, up to many more, 7 to 8 more. Um, Between 15 and 41 more individual birds, so the abundance of birds went up, and we had better evenness of birds. So the communities that had those trees along their edges or other types of habitat weren't dominated by just a single species, but actually had a more even mix of species in them. And we found that these effects were strongest for hedgerows that were actually at middle distances away from those source habitats like the mountainous region. And we think that's because out in those middle distances away, birds were still able to find those habitats and utilize them. They weren't so far away that birds couldn't locate them. They weren't that isolated, but they also weren't so close that birds could just pick the better habitat over them. So where those habitats are, I think collectively across the farming landscape, putting habitats like these in or retaining existing habitat can play a really, really important role in bringing birds onto farms. So like I said, that's one of like many, many studies that have shown the effects of providing habitat for birds. And the resources that the Wild Farm Alliance is putting together and putting out there are really, really helpful in helping farmers make decisions about what they can do and how they can start small or big or whatever it is that they want to start with, putting in boxes, things like that. And then how you can move forward with other potential practices to increase the bird diversity and the wildlife diversity on your farms. Um, One important question that farmers have is if you have more bird-friendly farming practices, do you end up with more bird damage? And I'll tell you that the general consensus is that that's not usually the case. This talk today isn't so much about bird damage, but I'd be happy to answer questions about that if you have any. But I think also, and something that we often sense the death of economic ornithology, when pesticides became widespread, we sort of lost that really important knowledge of generations past about the potential role that birds play in protecting our farms and in being part of the farming ecosystem. So I'm going to highlight a few of those studies here and talk to you a little bit about how we actually do these experiments, because I think the next few lectures in this series will highlight lots of different studies that have used methods like these to understand the benefits that birds provide. So I'm going to go through some slides that will show you kind of one by one how we use these methods in the field for understanding the role of birds on farms. So the first one to think about is observations. One example of this, and this is one that's a little bit harder because it's very, very time intensive, but all of you can do this. So if you're out in your backyard and you have birds coming through, just watching what they're doing and what they're eating. If you know that you've got an outbreak, like I've had caterpillar outbreaks on my pear tree in my own backyard, and I've seen some of our native birds coming in and just pulling all of those little caterpillars off of the tree. And this is how most of those kind of the history of economic ornithology came about, because we used to spend a lot more time watching the wildlife in our fields and in our backyards and in our day-to-day lives and realizing what role they played in the ecosystem. This is one example that was published a little while ago from India, where they were observing this jungle babbler species and found that they were eating quite a few of this pest of pigeon peas in their fields, and that when there was an increase in the pest in the fields, the number of these birds actually increased. So they actually came in to attack that larger population of pod borers, and were responding in numbers to the fact that there were more of those pests around. So that's observations. Another common method is exposures. This is a relatively time costly and material costly and kind of logistically difficult thing to do, but it's often the gold standard in terms of understanding the impact of birds on crop damage and yields. And so when we do exposure studies, we'll build, and these often, this picture up here is from a coffee plantation. I think the one on the right here is from cacao. This picture down here is from some of Sasha Heath's work in walnut orchards where she put codling moth larvae out. And this is from my own work in alfalfa where we put these they look like cages, and they essentially are cages, but they're cages that are meant to keep things out rather than to keep them in. And so they're set up in a way so that pest insects can go in and out of them, but birds can't get in. So it's kind of creating a condition where birds can access all the rest of a field or all the rest of a farm, but if birds disappeared overnight in that location, what would happen to it? And so you can understand that immediate impact on yield from birds in these types of systems. And I should say birds and bats are often the focus of this, not just birds alone. And this can work for other types of vertebrates as well. It generally has to be things that are too big to get into the cage itself. So for my own work, this is from a study we did in alfalfa, where we used these cages and or these exclosures. We designed them with the farmers we were working with. We were in conventional alfalfa fields to be relatively lightweight so they could be moved, and we kind of flagged where they were if they had to go back. They had to be exactly the right height that a spray unit could go over the top of them. They had to be placed in the rows in a way that they weren't in the way of tractors. But we were able to do this work in 32 different fields, and we were looking at alfalfa weevils, which is one of the things that Joanne showed you a photo of from the economic ornithology literature. And this is a really important crop for California. So we were looking at it in winter and early spring, which is the first growth and when the alfalfa weevil tends to have the largest impact on farmers in this region. And what we found was that When birds were excluded from the crop, there was about a 33% increase in the number of weevils per kilogram of alfalfa. So there's a much higher abundance of this pest in the crop when birds couldn't access it. Um, and we found that actually, as the abundance of birds increased in each field, the overall number of alfalfa weevils in both the areas the birds could access and the areas the birds could not access decreased. And that's probably because the birds were suppressing the overall population across the whole field. Another example of an exposure study is from lychee fruit or lychee in South Africa. And this one just came out very recently, but it's such a cool study because they were excluding birds, bats, and primates, but the yield difference was enormous. So it was a 42 kilogram loss in yield per tree when those vertebrates were excluded from the tree because of insect damage. So they were actually preventing that much damage from occurring to the crop. Um, and in comparison, and this is why it is often important to look at both the benefits and the costs side by side, but in comparison, in the sites, in the trees where the vertebrates could access them, there was only about a 1 to 2 increase, 1 to 2 kilogram increase in damage. So they lost a little bit of the crop to those vertebrates. But that change of about 2 kilograms versus a 42 kilogram increase really was, not significant. Um, Another thing that we do is supplement the birds on farm. So you can do that by putting up bird boxes, as Joanne was talking about. You can do it by increasing the abundance of birds by releasing birds, and that's really rare, but that's something that I did my PhD on with the New Zealand falcon. But you can do things that will actually supplement the birds in more artificial ways than putting in habitat. But some of the evidence from these types of studies is really, really incredible. So this is some work we did in California where we found that the annual biomass requirements for just one pair of breeding barn owls and their chicks in 1 year was almost 100 kilograms. And this is a gross picture, but it can show you just the amount of food that this barn owl, this very sleepy barn owl, is bringing into its chicks in one season. You can also put in crop perches. So artificial perches are common in the United States for things like birds of prey, and they work really well. But you can also plant more ephemeral perches like sunflowers or sorghum along the edges of fields, and that can bring in other birds that might then forage in the field. And in India, they found that that helped to decrease pod borer abundance in chickpeas. Another thing we do when we don't really have when you don't have large outbreaks of insects or you need to control for conditions in some way to understand the relative pressure from birds on insect pests, is you can put out what are called sentinel prey. So they're not actually the pests that are in the field, but you can control for how much of them are in the field. And you can then go out and monitor them over time to see how quickly they're attacked. And this is a study from Julie Jedlicka's work when she was in California, where she found that when there were bluebird nest boxes, so there's supplementation here, but when there were bluebird nest boxes nearby, there was a much higher rate of insect removal of sentinel prey than there were when there were just random nest boxes or no nest box at all. And then there have been lots of diet studies. So the barn owl example I showed you was based on pellet dissections. The old-fashioned style, which is no longer legal, it would be to kill birds and look at their stomachs, like Joanne was talking about. It is very unlikely to happen anymore, so that is no longer a method that is used. But we do things, you can look into the feces themselves and actually dissect them. And in some birds, you'll find the parts of different insects that have survived the digestive tract. In birds of prey and wading birds, you can look at the pellets of what they regurgitate, all the non-digestible parts. And then the kind of new and exciting frontier is using DNA metabarcoding or eDNA to look at what they've eaten, and that helps us capture everything, even the very soft things that are digestible that we normally wouldn't see if we were dissecting a pellet, for example. So this is a study from Spain And this one just came out recently too, and they used DNA metabarcoding. So they were looking at the feces of lots of different bird species. So this plot is a network analysis, and it's showing on the right here, these are all different species of birds. And on the left, it's showing different pest species of apples in this region. And so they were catching and actually processing the feces of all these different species. But I hope what is apparent here, even though it is kind of complicated graph, is that you need a good team. You need depth in your defense here when you have a lot of different pest species in a crop. And so all of these different bird species combined are working together to eat these different pest species on the left here. And there are some groups of birds that are better at eating groups of insects, but part of the reason we have such a diversity of birds on the planet is because they've evolved and adapted to attacking different types of insects. And there's this kind of evolutionary war that's going on and trying insects trying to escape birds and birds kind of specializing more or getting better at catching different insect prey. So overall, birds are kind of considered, I would consider them nature's bug zappers. They're really important for pest control in ecosystems and farmland around the world. This is a kind of wonky graph of just some of the examples of crops that have been shown to benefit from birds worldwide. Overall, coffee and cacao are actually the most studied systems for bird control of pests. So about 32 of the 130 or so pest control studies that have been done um, were from cacao and coffee. And the good thing in that system then is that there's so much evidence that they can do things like compare lots of studies to each other. And what they've found is that generally, and this is, I would argue, probably true of all crops, as the increase in species of bird on a farm, as it goes up, you have a corresponding increase in the reduction of pest species on those farms. So these are all different studies rather than different species or farms, but they're all showing this general trend that providing habitat for birds on farms leads to an increase in species richness, and that leads to increases in the benefits that farmers get. And the overall impact, it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around, but this is across all ecosystems on the planet. But insectivorous birds may be consuming 400 to 500 million tons of insects every single year. And the authors of this study calculated that in terms of joules of energy, and they worked out that it's about the amount of energy that the megacity of New York uses every year as well. So birds are really contributing a lot to our ecosystems and are really, really important. Um, so critically, Aldo Leopold from the Midwest pointed out that conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. And so I think it's really exciting that we are doing more work in the Midwest, and that all of you are here today because there is so much to learn about the systems there, and there will be other talks in this series about what people are doing in the Midwest and how it's working. Um, but we really have a lot of opportunity in farmland to make relatively small changes that will add up to really large impacts for birds and then for farmers. So thank you for your time. I'm sorry, I can't see a clock, so I hope I haven't gone too far over. But please reach out if you have any questions.
No, that was really great. Thanks so much, Sarah. We have another two poll questions that we're going to pop up here on your screen. And if you could answer those, that would be helpful. Um, and again, there's two. We're not trying to induce any anxiety. We just want to, get some feedback and see if you're paying attention and have it be a little more interactive. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be getting to those here in just a second or two. Sarah, you want to go over those questions and answers?
Yeah, I think collectively you guys get an A. So yeah, we the most studied, and I'm sorry I was talking really fast, but the most studied crops are coffee and cacao. Although the numbers of studies in other crops is growing. Grain crops and corn and feed crops are actually pretty understudied, especially when you consider the footprint of those crops. So I worked it out last night. Coffee and cacao together there's about 20 million hectares of that grown across the planet. And wheat alone, there are 220 million hectares. So a whole order of magnitude more wheat being grown than those two crops. Um, and we don't know that much about the impact of birds in some of these systems, aside from some of those older studies that Joanne was pointing out. So lots to learn in those systems for sure. Um, and then for what we don't use, this is like, I'm sorry, I'm a teacher and I should know better, but this is one of those kind of negative questions that is often difficult to read. But the thing that we don't currently do, that is generally frowned upon or usually illegal, is dissecting the stomachs of birds. The only times that we generally look at the stomachs of birds is if they've been killed by mistake for some reason. So sometimes we'll look at the most recent meal of a bird that's been hit by a car or something like that. But stomach dissections generally don't give us that much information, and you have to have a dead bird to dissect their stomach, whereas all of these other methods you can do without really disturbing the birds too much.
Awesome. We have a couple of questions in the chat that we want to get to here. So someone said at their farm forest in northern Minnesota, mosquitoes have disappeared in the last 3 years. They have 30 forest bird nest boxes and good habitat. Can any birds be credited with this outcome?
I think so. I mean, that's again where it's like as a scientist putting my science hat on, like proving that gets a little bit difficult unless you kind of take all the boxes away again and see if the mosquitoes come back, which I don't think any of us want you to do. But swallows eat tons of mosquitoes, which I think I saw Ashley wrote. Um, and so I know some people, when they have swallows nesting in their barns, they kind of get, it's like you'll get all the feces below the nest, and often it's kind of a blackish looking poop. And that's because they're eating all of these tiny flying insects, which usually are black. So they're eating things like mosquitoes. So um, probably swallows, but also if you have put any bat boxes up, they may also be helping you, particularly with those night flying mosquitoes as well.
Yeah, and I know Julie Jedlicka's work showed that bluebirds were eating mosquitoes, a lot of them, which she was surprised about.
Excellent. Another question is, how can you protect sunflowers and sorghum from deer overpopulation?
Hmm,
Whew. Um,
That's another,
it's a little
that's
bit outside of my area of expertise, but I mean, what we do with birds is we're looking at essentially trophic levels, and so which is kind of just describing food chains. And so we're looking at bringing in predators of insects, or I also study predators of mammals and predators of birds, but usually those are bird predators. Um, Having predators around, even if they're not eating all of the deer or insects or bird pests, um, will change the behavior of those potential pests. Um, some people put fences up, but um, predators of things like deer are a little bit contentious. I like Jonathan's answer of starting a new venison diet. Um, yeah, you can haze deer, but deer are very abundant and they're definitely a problem in the Midwest. And actually, some of my other areas of research look at deer and wildlife in cities and the role they play in spreading, moving ticks around and potentially spreading Lyme disease. So there's a lot of complexity in that one.
Yeah, that's a trick question for you. The exclusion texts work great for plants, but how would one do the same sort of thing but with livestock?
Ooh. I'd have to think about what the pest was in the livestock, um, and what you would do there. You could do something like if you're thinking about birds picking ticks or some kind of um, exoparasite on the outside of the livestock, you could potentially put like sentinel prey on them. You could glue like mealworms to the backs of things and see how quickly they get taken off. But I'm not really sure what the context is there, so I don't know that I can answer that question fully. But it's a really good question and something that would be interesting to think about. I guess I've worked with ranchers in California where we put up artificial perches for birds of prey, and we monitored whether or not birds use them, but then we also monitored rodent populations at the same time. So we were trying to, and we did see that there was a change in the frequency that we were detecting the rodent prey at the places at the perches that were essentially popular with birds of prey. So.
Um, I think we're going to have speakers later in this series address some of the insect and livestock questions. I know there's a speaker from Europe who's going to talk about barn swallows that nest inside barns with cattle and how she's seen those um, flies mainly decrease. So,
Yeah, that's what Amos, it looks like, was asking about flies. Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, so stay tuned.
And it looks like he has a follow-up question about, I have a diverse mix of trees on my farm already. Is it worth doing nest boxes as well?
I mean, cavities are the trees supporting cavities. If there's a lot of cavities, then maybe you don't need nest boxes. But I would think that in today's world, there's never enough cavities, i.e., even if they're artificial nest boxes.
Yeah, I think even in like in California where we have old oak trees with lots of, cavity holes for nests to go in. Um, the tree swallows and some of the other swallows and bluebirds are still using those boxes. And actually bluebirds I think often prefer the boxes that are a little farther away. So um, you can augment and supplement the population of those insectivores because often they're limited by the number of cavities.
Mhm.
And then you can monitor them too, which is really cool.
Excellent. There's another question about, if I'm starting with almost zero edge habitat on my property, is there an ideal type of vegetation to add first?
Check out our publication that describes which kinds of habitat um, support birds. Courtney, do you remember the name of that? It's
The Midwest plant bird chart.
yes, yes, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and then when we work with farmers putting in habitat, we really discuss what that site needs. Like, can you have tall trees that might shade, or do you need to put in shorter shrubs? And or in the Midwest, are you in a situation where it's all prairie and you don't want those tall species? You can still put in forbs and grasses. So depends on who you're trying to attract and what the situation is on the farm. If you have any kind of waterway or riparian area, that's an amazing place to build up habitat because so many species use that. It's like it's connectivity, it's connected habitat, and yeah, it's just a diverse place for birds to go.
And I think talk to like if there's a local NRCS office or any ag extension type people in your state. Some of the other speakers in the seminar are from the Midwest and are working with farmers who have put habitat in, and often it's other farmers that have a lot of good experience with kind of what worked well on their properties. So if you do try it, Elena, like it would be great to learn what goes well for you and what doesn't, you know, thrive in that system. And to use that knowledge for other farmers too.
Have you done any monitoring with Audubon certified bird-friendly ranches in California or other states?
Maggie, yes, some of the work we did, well, actually, the ranch survey I did was with the Nature Conservancy Ranch, but it was a bird-friendly ranch. And I know that Audubon California has been doing monitoring on those ranches as well. Joanne, have you worked with the Audubon-friendly ranches?
No, I mean we've talked to the people who run that program and think it's wonderful, but yeah, haven't
And
done.
those are the types of that kind of group can also be really helpful for different types of plantings or other things you might put onto your property if they're operating in your area already.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Sarah and Joanne for sharing your knowledge. Thanks to everybody for attending. This webinar is part of the series that is being funded by a professional development grant from North Central Region of SARE. And so we want to thank SARE for help making this possible. We'd love your feedback. If you need any CE credits, we need your license number. So please follow the link to the evaluation where you can give us your license number and your name so we can make sure you get those credits. In addition to this webinar, there are a bunch of resources that are available on the resource page. There's a video about birds nesting on farms. There's a link to the Supporting Beneficial Birds and Managing Pest Birds, that important document that outlines 120 different studies of birds on farms and also shares 10 stories of innovative farmers as well as protecting the Birds in Agricultural Landscape publication. And we hope to see you at our next webinar on October 14th. So thank you so much for attending.